Hi, everybody, and welcome to another exciting topic. Now, we're gonna introduce you to things that gonna make you more serious programmers, okay, in IT. What we're going to talk about today is that what's a concept called variables, and this variables is actually exist in our day-to-day life, but we don't recognize it. Okay, for example. Now, if we take a look at the example that we have done before, I mean, let me just open the examples that we've done before. What we have, for example, we've been using this square as a starting point. Now, a square, we turned it into a building later on, and then we say that this building has sizes and have different dimensions. These dimensions can vary from a house to a house, and this variation in the measurements or the facts about something that we call those are variables. Why they're variables? Because they change. For example, in this case, we're just drawing a box, and this box has equal sides, and this side is 100, this side is 100, this side is 100. But if I want to make it more realistic, and then I can make it like we did with the building, this side would be the length of the building, and then this would be the width of the building. So how do we reflect that in our program? This is one. The other thing is that we can do, for example, we can say things like you're a student. Every student has an ID. The common thing about these students, when we represent these students on the computer, is that they all have IDs, but the value of that ID might different from it will be different from one person to another person. Another thing about is, for example, is your date of birth. Now, date of birth is unique to a particular person, so that date of birth can vary from one person to another person. So that is the concept of variables. So we're gonna start with the simple examples about variables. This buildings, how we can make our programming easier. How do we make it more realistic when we draw these shapes? Okay. So I'm gonna introduce you to the concepts of variables. We're gonna start with a simple thing. Remember that that building that we had, we gave different dimensions. So if I wanted to say, okay, I'm gonna say length equal 200 and width equal 100, right? Now, if instead of using these forward and then this forward numbers, now all I need to do is I use these names that I gave to these values, these were called variables, in my drawing. So I simply say, for example, now for the width of the building is going to be W, the length of the building is going to be L. So every time I want to draw the width, I just use that W, and I can use the L to draw the length. Now, if I draw my box, notice it changed. The beauty about this is that I don't need to go every time I don't like this shape. I don't like the size of this building. Maybe the building is too tall. Maybe the house is too narrow. All I have to do is just simply go in here and say, okay, maybe I can make it a little bit wider. So I changed the width of my building by 150. Notice now I got a different shape. So that is the nice thing about variables. Variables are changing, things that change. And in addition to that, you can do with it is that you can actually change it one time and it would reflect everywhere in your program. And that value stays there until you change it. So I'll give you just simple example. So I made for example, I can say here, if before I draw L again, if I say L equal now 300 for some reason, okay, which is a silly reason, but I just want to show you the effect of it. It started with 200. Now it did all these steps, but when I got to this, it got changed. So the old value that was in there is gone, and we have a new value, and that's what variables means. They can change. So now if I click on this, notice now it's gonna draw this side is a lot longer. Why? Because the L got changed, okay? So that is what we do with how we define variables. Now, this is a simple example. We can do a lot more. Now, just like any other, when we talked about these commands, when we talked about learning new commands, that there is a language, there is rules about these languages, these computer languages, there is a syntax that we have to worry about. And just like Dr. Hamid explained previously in the PowerPoint, there are actually rules that you need to follow when you name these variables. This is my rules, if you remember from the previous PowerPoint. Now it says here, all variable names must be what? Must start, begin with a letter, A through Z, capital A through B, and or underscore. Okay, so let's just see what happens if you did something different. If we go back to the REPL, and for some reason, I decided to rename this 1W, all right? 1W. What kind of impact does that have on your program? Watch what happens. If I did run, I will get errors. First, it says bad input on line 7. You cannot start a variable name with what? With a number, okay? You can have letters or underscore. Now you can have numbers, but these numbers can be after. So let's say I actually did this. I changed it to capital W, all right? See what kind of impacts this will have. Now we click on run again. Again, I got an error. What does the error now says? It says, wait a minute, the name W is not defined. And that is a very, very, very common problem. A lot of students, when they are actually writing these programs, they tend to forget how they define things. So typically, it's a good idea to follow a standard naming convention, all right? So I go, okay, we got the problem. So W, you're saying, this program is saying, this, you define this variable to be capital W. It's case sensitive. Here you're using lower W, okay, lowercase w. So the two are not the same because you're using one higher lowercase and one is uppercase. So to fix the problem, I need to do something with this guy here. Okay, so when you click on it now, no errors, but it works. Another possible ways about the rules is that you can say you should not have a space between the names, between the variable name and when you're defining variable names. So if I say room, just to give you an example, if I say building or room width, if I do this and make a space like that, again, it will have an issue with it. What's the issue? It says, wait a minute, this issue is that this line 7 is a bad input. You cannot have a space when you're naming variable name. So what is my recommendation to you? How do you make things easy for you so you don't get frustrated? What is my recommendation is that you make sure that you name your variables with lowercase, start with lowercase only, and numbers, if you use any numbers, you use the numbers afterward. Now, it has to be one word. It cannot be a word with a space. If you decide to put a space in between, you can use the underscore. So to do this, all I could have, to avoid that problem with the space, I could have just used room underscore and the width, okay? So now, of course, we can't do that because we're using W here, right? So we can leave it as W, and then we are happy. All right. Now let's take a look at the other naming convention, and then we were not gonna make this too long. We'll make it just a starting of variables. The other thing that you can do is that we talked about the characters can be. It has to be character and a letter number later on. It is case sensitive. It means that the uppercase and the lowercase are different, and I showed you an example of that. It can be a reasonable length. You don't want to make it too long. You don't want to make it too short. And why do you do that? Make your descriptive of your variables meaningful. Room width, room length, building length. Why? Because when you're reading your program again, you understand what these variables are, okay? There are some reserved words you cannot use, meaning what? I'll show you. For example, if I go into the code again and I did this, I'll show you what happens. Remember, we learned some keywords. You remember the keywords that we've learned? For loop is one. In is one. Range is a keyword. So if I say for equal 1, notice the color of that 4 is what? It's the color of that 4 is blue. Now, if I try to run it, you get an error saying that bad input on line 8. Line 8 says, wait a minute, it doesn't, it should be a little bit more descriptive than that, but the word for is actually what we call keyword. This belongs to Python. It does not, we don't have a lot of flexibility of changing that name. So we need to avoid things like these keywords, okay? So now to fix it, you can say, and you can name it anything you want, and then you'll have no issue, all right? I'm gonna stop with this because I don't wanna make it too long, it'll become boring. We're gonna stop with this, but the important things about this is that you need to, with naming variables, we'll come back and do more exercises, but with naming variables, make sure that you stick to these rules, okay? This is a starting point, and it's very important starting point because it helps you move on and make things a lot better in the next in your programs.